All right, fellas, the Vector guys, they really understood the excitement. Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. It's your host, Paul, again. All right, so here's a little pop quiz for you, man. So let's say you're looking for LPVO, you want good glass, you want a simple but usable reticle, and you want daylight bright illumination, and you only have $500. Which one are you gonna buy? So if you said the Primary Arms 1-6 Nova, then you are right. So just like the Vortex PST brought daylight illumination to LPVOs under $1,000, the Primary Arms kind of did the same for LPVOs under 500. And it was the only choice.
No, there is another.
So when guys were asking me about looking at the Vector LPVOs, I had the same reaction you guys probably are doing right now. Like, hey, don't those dudes make airsoft scopes? Well, it turns out I did some research and I was wrong. They do make some legit rifle scopes, or at least according to what's on their website. So knowing there is a scope company out there making LPVOs that I really hadn't had any exposure to, I was kind of looking forward to hearing from them and hearing from others what they'd say. So I reached out to Vector and said, hey, would you guys be interested in sending a scope in for review? And they graciously agreed to do so. And this is the Vector 1-8 Continental that I have in my hands. So even though this is a newcomer to the LPVO market, I'm going to judge it by the exact same standards I do for all those other major brands that you've seen on this channel. So let's get started. So we'll first look at his profile as far as length and weight. Given that 10 inches is what many would consider average, this thing might look a little bit out of place since it's almost 11.5 inches long. So it's really close to that Collis 1-8 we looked at previously in the premium LPVO video. Personally, I don't think length is ever a deciding factor. I get that some dudes are really into aesthetics though, since shorter scopes are quote unquote cooler looking. However, if you're running night vision clip-ons on the front so you want to save on some rail space, that makes more sense to me. Just keep in mind though that the shorter the scope, the less depth of field you're going to have in focus. So take that into consideration. While length doesn't matter as much, weight does matter. And this comes in at just under 19 ounces. I think that's still a very good balance between weight and capability, considering you're getting 8X on the top end. Now, what helps keep that weight down is they opted for a 30mm scope tube, so be sure to find the right mount. Given that it's only 19 ounces, I don't think your choice of scope mount is going to make that much difference in overall weight. For this video, I'm using the antimatter LPVO scope switch, which adds about 10 ounces to the gun, so it's a little bit heavier than versus just choosing a QD mount. In exchange though, since this is an 8X on the top end, this scope switch is almost perfect since you can zoom in and out really quickly. If you want to hear more thoughts about the scope switch, I'll link to the video for you. So with the initial looks out of the way, let's take a closer look at the glass quality and the dot brightness. Okay, so if you look at the specs on the Vector site, they mentioned this is German optic system with Lurie glass. Personally, I've never heard of Lurie glass, but I see it mentioned in their other optics, so I'm assuming that the glass is shared among their product line. Additionally, when I hear quote unquote German optics, I automatically think of, hey, this is European glass like the Collis or Swarovski. Let me correct you on that assumption right away because you're not going to get that level of quality for $500. However, what I see in this Vector reminds me a lot of the Gen 4 glass and the PA Nova, so it's still very good glass. So when I'm looking at the center and pushing towards the edge, I want to see when the distortion sets in. For this optic, I say that point is close to the last 15% of the glass, so it's decently close to distortion free. As I mentioned earlier, it does remind me of a lot of the PA 1-6 Nova, so if you put them side by side, I'd have a hard time picking one over the other. While we're talking about that 1X, it does have a very large field of view, 124 feet, so it's pretty huge. However, if you stack it up next to the PA Nova, 120 feet, it's not super apparent which one is latter or 1X. Additionally, the Vector's bezel size is a little bit thicker than the Nova, so the scope doesn't quote unquote disappear as well. Just as a barometer, even though it's much more expensive, you can stack up the glass and the bezel on the Vector versus the more expensive Razor 1-6, and you can definitely see what you're paying for because you can see the difference here when it comes to glass quality, flatness of view of 1X, and red dot performance. Speaking of red dot performance, this reticle is also lit by fiber optic wire, so it is indeed daylight bright. At its brightest setting 11, it's just as bright as the PA Nova and the Razor 1-6. In daylight, you're going to have really minimal splashing of that orange illumination beyond the center reticle. Eye relief is plenty at 4 inches. As I found on the Vector, very comfortable to shoot at both 1X and even at 8X. Just keep in mind this is still a 24mm objective lens, so the X pupil gets really small and max magnification. You need to take extra time to properly align your eye, so you're looking straight down the scope without scope shadow. LPVO. Also at 8x, I did notice I had to be a little bit closer to the scope to get a full sight picture versus Nova at 6x. Now, as you zoom up, I think this is where you'll notice some compromises as clarity suffers a bit. You can see that the center is clear, but the distortion creeps in pretty quickly as you expand towards the edge. At 6x, I think it's relatively comparable to the PA Nova, but once you get to 8x, it's quite a bit more blurry toward the edges. It's not my favorite scope to shoot at 8x, but it's still workable. Again, just for comparison, if you're stacking up to the Razor 1-6, this is the type of clarity you're looking for when it comes to edge distortion. I think in real time when you're shooting under the clock, it's not as noticeable since you're looking through the center of the reticle and working your mill ladder. But if you're scanning for targets toward the outside of the scope, if you're pixel peeping here at 4K, it's a lot more noticeable, especially in lower light. And speaking of noticeable, even though I'm not particularly sensitive to color fringing, you'll probably notice there's a bit of it on the edge of these steel targets and the tree branches. You can see this in other scopes as well, with the NX8 being really bad, but for $500, I kind of expected this out of the scope, so it's not anything extreme or out of the ordinary. So now that we talk internals, let's back out and talk externals a bit. Looking at the turrets, I think the Vector guys were paying attention and smartly decided to do mill-based turrets and a mill-based reticle. For an LPVO, we typically don't dial, so chances are you're only going to use your turrets for zeroing. Having said that, they did a pretty decent job with the turrets given its budget, although I wouldn't really depend upon it for repeatability when it comes to continuous dialing. Their turrets are a locking design, so you need to lift them up to turn them, which is a good design in my opinion. When you turn in the clicks, there is a little bit of soft feeling, but there's just enough clicky feedback to register. However, there is quite a bit of play between each of the 0.1 clicks. Like most LPVOs, this does not have a zero stop, but you can reset the zero index point by undoing the top and side screws and realigning the zero notch. It's a little harder than I thought since realigning the index mark isn't like straight on, and if you're not straight on, you can't close the turret. As I mentioned, you're not dialing, so testing and tracking is not usually that important. However, just to add some data points, I did do a box test at 100 yards, starting with the lower left and moving 2.2 increments, and then back down to ensure that we return to our 100 yard zero. As you can see, the zero is holding, although I did see a little bit of movement to this further right, which I think is due to my index point that I mentioned earlier being a little bit off. One thing I mentioned is that it does have low profile cap turret, so this is perfect if you want to run a piggyback dot out front, so the turret is not obstructing your view. Towards your rear, you'll find the adapter, which turns pretty smooth, and it does have enough friction to remain in place. There is no index mark, however, so you may want to consider adding one to keep track of its position. Speaking of moving, as far as the magnification out, it turns relatively smoothly, although the friction is a little bit closer to what you'd find in the PA Nova, and that it's a little bit stiff, definitely not as smooth as something like a Razor. Since I'm using the antimatter scope switch here, that helps a lot. On the left, you'll find the illumination rotary knob, which goes all the way to 11. There are off positions in between, which is great, although you'll find that even though there's enough knob friction to keep the setting in place, the clicks in between them aren't really positive or clicky. You really have to listen and feel closely. Now that we've seen how the scope performs at short range and looked at the controls, let's take a closer look at it when we zoom up. So Vector has several different reticles for this optic, but the ED fiber is only one that's daylight bright with a crosshair and mill spacing. Their website is a little bit confusing to find this model, so please use the link below to take you directly to it. Their other reticles are not daylight bright as far as I know, so be sure to verify it's the ED fiber you're interested in the scope. I found that having a crosshair reticle is the best since it allows you to shoot tiny groups for a zero, and also you can see the impacts and targets a lot more easily. Vector's crosshair reticle is very similar to the PA Nova and also the Vortex VMR 2 mil reticle. However, it does lack the horizontal wind holds along its horizontal stadia. Typically, your wind holds are more important on the vertical ladder versus the horizontal ladder. However, if you dial instead of using your drops, then having horizontal hashes can be very useful. I'm not sure why Vector chose to omit those, but as long as you don't dial, you won't notice their absence. Speaking of that ladder, it is a mill-based ladder with evenly spaced subtensions of 1 mil each. So you're looking at a total of 6 mils down. Don't confuse that with the PA Nova reticle in that you have half mils in between. So you have more aiming points on the PA, but on the Vector, you can go further out. So depending on your loadout, mine goes out to 650 or so with the Vector, while the PA only takes me out to 550. Also note on the ladder, the Vector's width on the hashes is an even 1 mil all the way down. So it's the same. PA's hashes vary though, since they're using 18-inch shoulder width, so you can range with it. You could do the same with the Vector, although you have to do some math since it's just 1 mil wide, no matter the distance. So as far as shooting at distance, here we are in the Strelic Pro again to get our holds. As far as test ammo and rifle, we're using 69 grain reloads, going 2650 with a 100 yard zero through our 16-inch Criterion barrel. Remember though, since we're using scope switch, our height overbore is 3 3.2 versus a standard 2.7, so we need to change that. As far as the reticle, I couldn't find the ED fiber in Strelic, so what you'll need to do is input your target distance, and Strelic will tell you your holds in mils. From here, use your reticle and count down to the correct mil hash line. Remember, there's no half mil, so you need to hold high or low depending upon your target. You can also use the table feature in the bottom right corner to build your hold sheet. On our long distance shoot, I'm shooting these 18-inch reduced silhouettes from 200 to 600 yards, all using the reticle for drops, because typically that's what we do for an LPVO. One thing to remember is that this is a second focal plane reticle, so your holds are only accurate at max magnification, so just 8x. My feelings about this are mixed. I prefer second focal plane with 6x on the top end, but once you start getting to 8 or 10x, a first focal plane reticle is a lot more useful since you can dial down your magnification and your holds are still accurate. And at 8x magnification, you tend to lose a lot of field of view. However, the more I shoot this, the more I really like having 8x now versus 6x, since my first round percentage goes up a lot. But since I've started using this scope switch quite a bit, I found that I can zoom in to max to engage one target, and then zoom out to increase the field of view, find the next target, and zoom back in to re-engage. So just doing this pattern over and over, I found that it's working really well for me. All right, fellas, so for final thoughts, so far, so good. This thing is holding up. Surprise, surprise, right? So far, I've had this thing in training sessions. I've shot this thing in matches. So we're hovering around 1,000 rounds on this scope. So I haven't run into major issues, and I haven't run into really big usability issues so far, as you've seen from the previous video. So does this mean this thing's good to go and you should start run out and buy it? Well, number one, I don't have any sight line on where these things are manufactured or how these guys are sourcing their parts. For all I know, these guys are sourcing the same parts from the same OEMs overseas. So if it's, whether it's Primary Arms or Vector, if the Primary Arms 1-6 Nova is holding up, which it has been, I've shot that thing a lot, then chances are the Vector 1-8 is going to hold up as well. Having said that, I think that since this scope is relatively new to the market from a brand that I haven't really heard of, I think that you need to do your due diligence and test it more. Anytime you have a scope that's being used by a lot of people, you have a really big data set. And when you have a scope that's being used by a few people, you have a smaller data set. And the smaller your data set is, the more inaccurate that trend line is going to be. And you don't really know how it's going to hold up in long term. So what I'm going to do, and what I would recommend you to do, is if you get a scope, shoot it for as many thousands of rounds as you can to see if you can work out any issues with it, because that's what I'm going to do with the scope, and I promise you I'll keep you updated on it. I'll let you know if I have any problems with it, but so far so good. All right, fellas, that's it for this video. Thanks for joining us again. I appreciate it. If you're interested in any equipment seen in this video, check the links below, and as always, subscribe and link if you really like this video. Thanks again. See you next time.